America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the Kingdom of Denmark, a strong economic and security partner of the United States. Our guest is His Excellency Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Mr. Rasmussen has been at the center of European and global politics for over 3 decades as a leading Danish parliamentarian, Danish Minister of Economic Affairs, Prime Minister of Denmark, and finally as Secretary General of NATO. Upon leaving NATO, Mr. Rasmussen founded his strategic advisory firm, Rasmussen Global. He is also the chairman of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, a non-profit organization for the advancement of democracy and free markets across the globe. Denmark is strategically located between the North and Baltic Seas, comprising the Jutland Peninsula and over 400 islands, as well as its self-governing territories of Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The Kingdom of Denmark is the oldest monarchy in Europe, with current Queen Margrethe II tracing her ancestry to the Vikings. The Vikings ruled Scandinavia from the 8th century to the mid-11th century. The baptism of Danish King Harald Bluetooth in 965 CE instituted an era of Christian influence in Danish society. Waves of Nordic unity, rivalry, and European wars shaped Danish governance in the following centuries. The Kalmar Union of 1397 joined Denmark, Sweden, and Norway under the rule of Queen Margrethe I. Sweden broke from the Kalmar Union in 1523, in one of multiple clashes that led Denmark to ceding key territories to Sweden in the 17th and the 19th centuries. The Danish Constitution of 1849 established Denmark as a bicameral parliamentary constitutional monarchy, and the Constitution of 1953 instituted a unicameral system and protections for civil rights. The United States and Denmark have enjoyed a peaceful and productive relationship. The two countries established diplomatic ties in 1801, and Denmark sold the Danish West Indies, today known as the U.S. Virgin Islands, to the United States in 1917. Denmark declared neutrality in World War I, though Germany leveraged Denmark's trade dependence on it to influence Denmark toward the Central Powers. World War I prompted another shift in Danish territory. Iceland gained sovereignty in 1918 as a kingdom that shared the Danish monarchy. Though Denmark declared neutrality once more in World War II, Nazi Germany occupied Denmark without significant resistance. The British subsequently occupied Iceland, and a national referendum created the Republic of Iceland in 1944. After the war, Denmark became a founding member of NATO and the United Nations. Today, Denmark is the only Nordic member of both NATO and the European Union, and the United States and Denmark partner closely on issues of international security and trade. Despite its small size, Denmark is one of the most active NATO allies supporting U.S. operations. Danish troops have been in Iraq and Afghanistan and incur high per capita casualties in combat. The Danish Air Force has flown missions against ISIS, and its Navy has sailed in anti-piracy operations. The United States and Denmark are strong trade partners and share investments in areas such as pharmaceuticals. Its government structure and safety have made it a destination for immigrants and asylum seekers from around the world. Denmark is a global leader in renewable energy and sustainability, as well as a pioneer in high-tech agriculture and maritime shipping solutions. Danish scientists lead efforts to overcome the interrelated challenges of climate security, food and water security, and energy security. With control of Greenland, Denmark is a key player in discussions of the administration and protection of the Arctic. We welcome Prime Minister Rasmussen ahead of the 2021 NATO summit in Brussels, Belgium, and as global markets emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Prime Minister Rasmussen, welcome to Battlegrounds. It was great to see you, at least on Zoom, at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit. And I appreciate you joining me and our audience, because I know you're going to provide us with tremendous insights and perspective on the challenges and opportunities we face across the free world. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Well, I thought we'd just dive right in to take full advantage of your time. And I wanted to begin by talking about first the Baltic region and Denmark, of course, from your time as Prime Minister, well before that, had a key role during the Cold War in keeping the Soviet Union in check, checking its aggressiveness, mainly by the use of its submarine force that could have bottled up the Soviet Navy in the Baltic. We took a little bit of a holiday from great power competition, in the 1990s, I think, under the assumption that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. But of course, now it seems as if great power competition is back with a vengeance and kind of in a new form. And I wonder if you might comment what you see as Denmark's role today in keeping Russian offensive forays in check. Do you think NATO is strong enough, to keep the Baltic Sea open in case of a conflict, or strong enough to hopefully deter conflict with Russia?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say NATO could do more, but NATO has done a lot more in recent years. You're quite right that in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, we thought we had entered a new era, and we started to decrease our investments in defense. But not least, the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014 was an eye-opener. And we have seen a stronger Russian presence in the Baltic region as well. So that the role of Denmark will be exactly the same in the coming years to keep the Russians at bay. And in that respect, we are pursuing in particular two roads. Firstly, we are participating in the air policing of the Baltic states. And secondly, Denmark is also actively participating in the NATO forward presence, enhanced forward presence in the East. We have had 200 Danish troops as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence in Estonia up until 2020, and we are due to rotate there again in March 2022. So Denmark is still active in countering Russian aggression in the Baltic region.
And I think this is the key, obviously, is to deter by denial, right? To convince Russia it could not accomplish its objectives through the use of force. And as you mentioned, really important for us to realize that Russia continues to be aggressive vis-a-vis Ukraine. Denmark and Norway are, of course, NATO members. Sweden's not, but participates along with other NATO allies in various operations and considers itself, I think the phrase is, received and a provider of security in the region. What are your thoughts about the future of Baltic and Nordic defense? Do you think Sweden will or should join NATO?
Yeah, on the latter, if Sweden should join NATO, my answer is yes. I think Sweden should join NATO, and Sweden fully qualifies for joining NATO, and Sweden would be welcomed wholeheartedly should Sweden decide to join NATO. But I will refrain from interfering in the Swedish debate. But we have seen actually an increased support for Swedish membership of NATO during recent years. And there is an ongoing, sometimes a bit heated discussion in Sweden. In that respect, I think Putin is of great help to us because the Russian pressure on its neighbors in the Baltic region, including Sweden and Finland, by the way, has strengthened those forces that believe in Swedish and also Finnish membership of NATO as the best security guarantee. Having said that, we have already a very close partnership with Sweden and Finland. Sweden is and Finland are, I would say, the closest partners we do have. And they could join NATO overnight if they decided to do so, because they have really built up a military that fulfills the criteria, the standards for being active NATO members. And Sweden, for instance, has also participated actively in NATO-led operations in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Iraq, and also in Libya. I think Sweden is prepared, but it's for them to take the decision.
You know, there has been a pattern of aggression by Russia. I think that has woken everybody up. We should maybe send Mr. Putin some flowers and a box of chocolates, you know, in terms of, of focusing everybody on the importance of NATO. And of course, this goes back to the denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007, the invasion of Georgia, and obviously Ukraine remains a real focus of Russian aggression and intimidation. We see the recent expansion of its control over the Black Sea. And now it has this consistent presence in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. And what are your thoughts about what Russia's trying to achieve and how that fits in to what they've been trying to achieve in the Baltic Sea and really across this range of sort of westward pushes by Russia?
Yeah, I think Russia, no, let me put it this way. I consider Russia a regional spoiler. Russia does not have the capacity to really disturb the world order as such. In that respect, it's a clear difference between Russia and China. Russia is a declining society. China is a rising society. That makes the difference. And we can speak about China later. But Russia can destabilize security in Europe and Middle East, in the near neighborhood, and they do. And they are pursuing, I would say, three paths to achieve their goals: militarily, economically, and politically. Militarily, they have destabilized eastern Ukraine, annexed Crimea into the Russian Federation. They have de facto occupied parts of Georgia. And in Moldova, Russia has contributed to a frozen conflict in Transnistria, which is a region in Moldova. But it is in Russia's interest to keep those conflicts, frozen conflicts, to weaken their neighbors and prevent them from joining the Western alliances, NATO and European Union. Economically, Russia is putting pressure on its neighbors in Central Eastern Europe. One example is the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline through the Baltic Sea. Another example is the port system in the Baltic Sea. Actually, Russia represents only 7% of the coastline in the Baltic Sea, but around 50% of the trade from Russia is passed through the ports in the Baltic Sea. And now they're building their own ports to circumvent the ports of their neighbors in Eastern and Central Europe, to deprive them from economic benefits. And finally, Russia is also pursuing political goals through meddling into democratic processes in other countries, through disinformation campaigns, through intimidation of internal, external critics of the system in the Kremlin. So they have a very clear goal, and they are pursuing those goals through a three-pronged strategy.
Yes, it does seem to me that Putin he's cognizant of the limitations in his strength, limitations in economic strength and in conventional forces, and what some people have called Russian new generation warfare. The combination of these elements of power that you mentioned aims to accomplish Russia's objectives, maybe below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted military response from Russia. NATO's been looking at this quite hard. We had the report of the NATO Reflection Group. NATO's working on a new strategic concept. We have a very important conference coming up, and I just wonder if you'd share your thoughts on what more NATO needs to do to focus on deterring Russia and deterring, of course, what we always want to deter, the worst we can imagine, right? A large-scale conflict that could lead to a nuclear conflict. But how do we deter this Russian new generation warfare? What more can NATO do?
I'd point to three elements. Firstly, we should continue investing more in our defense. In that respect, President Trump used very harsh rhetorics, and it helped, I think, to promote more European investment in defense. In 2014, we decided that within the next decade, all allies should live up to at least 2% of their GDP in defense investment. And more member states do that. So we are on the right track. We should continue that as deterrence against Russian aggression. Secondly, we should ensure investments in more modern capabilities within hybrid warfare. Because you're quite right, Russia tries to circumvent the NATO Article 5. Article 5, as we all know, is a famous article that states that we consider an attack on one an attack on all. So Russia knows that they have no chance to win a conventional battle, but they are trying to lower, so to speak, the threshold for an activation of Article 5 by using other means, including cyber attacks and hybrid warfare, meddling in other countries' affairs, etc., etc. And then the third element would be more unity within our alliance. We can do a lot more if we, under American leadership, demonstrates a clear unity across the Atlantic. So I hope the upcoming NATO summit will be such a demonstration of transatlantic unity.
It's Russia and China, I think, both, Prime Minister, trying to break apart the alliance and disrupt the alliance, at least to reduce our confidence in our collective security. And of course, there are some direct threats, in connection with increasing military capabilities. China is already present in the geographic theater of NATO in Southeastern Europe and the Mediterranean, and it continues to pursue a range of activities, maybe more economic even than Russia, economic activities in the realm of technology, with trying to dominate, 5th-generation communications infrastructure. How do you see NATO? What do you think NATO's role is in connection with various forms of Chinese aggression? This campaign China's been waging of co-opt companies and countries into its orbit with the promise of investment or access to the Chinese market, and then coercing these companies to support China's promotion of its mercantilist authoritarian model, and then to conceal its activities as just normal business practices. It seems to me a very pernicious threat what's NATO's role, do you think, in the competition with an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, that's really the key issue in the coming years, in my opinion, because while Russia can be a regional spoiler, China is already a global spoiler of the world order. So we have to address this, and we need a new strategy towards this Chinese assertiveness. And that also goes for NATO. NATO should realize that territorial defense in today's world does not stop at our borders. China is an example of a country that tries to spread its influence across the globe. And also NATO has to address this new challenge. In the past, it was excluded that NATO member states even discussed China. But a couple of years ago at the NATO summit in London, the first step was taken to address this new challenge. And I am convinced that the upcoming NATO summit will have to deal with China in a much more concrete way. And as far as China is concerned, we see exactly the same strategy deployed as in the case of Russia, that is, militarily, economically, and politically, we see China exercise influence all over the globe. And that's not in the interest of the world's free societies.
Prime Minister, one of the topics that I'm sure going to come up at the NATO summit is the role of the EU in defense efforts. This is an issue that's been talked about for many years. And I wondered if you might comment on what you see the role is for the EU in deterring Russia. Should the EU be developing its own military capabilities separate from or complementary to or integrated with NATO? And how effective is the EU at competing with China? And what's your position on the role of the EU in collective defense? And is that a problem in connection with maybe diminishing the role of NATO if the EU were to follow President Macron's challenge for the EU to become more capable militarily?
Actually, you're raising two issues. One is European defense capabilities, and the other one is how to address China. So if I would start with China. I think Europe has become less naive when it comes to addressing the Chinese aggression in recent years. But first of all, I would like to stress some circles in Europe tend to believe that Europe could play, so to speak, a moderating role between the United States and China.
This is the strategic autonomy argument.
That's a strategic autonomy argument. Yes, that's right. In my opinion, that is a fundamental mistake. What we're witnessing these years is a battle between dictatorship and democracy. And in that battle, you cannot stay neutral. There is no ideological equality between the United States and China. We have to counter the autocracy represented by the Chinese Communist Party and side with America in the fight for freedom. Maybe we can revert to that issue, but that's my basic point of view. How could Europe counter the increasing Chinese assertiveness? In the economic field, I think Europe has already a lot of tools. We have seen how China has made strategic investments in strategically important infrastructure and within strategically important business sectors in recent years that did so in the wake of the financial crisis, and they are ready to do exactly the same in the wake of the corona crisis. So we have to introduce screening mechanisms that are much more strict than the current screening mechanisms to avoid a Chinese takeover of strategically important assets in Europe. The Chinese are also pursuing or making economic coercion, as you mentioned. Private companies have been exposed to consumer boycotts in China because they have underlined the need for respecting human rights in China. Australia has been exposed to a boycott of, or at least sanctions on, Australian wine and other products. And I could mention other countries as well. I think we need much more cooperation between the world's democracies and also within the European Union solidarity to prevent that kind of Chinese blackmailing. And finally, China is also exercising unfair trade practices, stealing our technology, competing with our companies with state subsidies to help their own companies. And our screening mechanisms should prevent that kind of unfair trade practices as well. And within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we should insist on full compliance with fair trade practices. I think in those areas, the European Union has a lot of tools at its disposal.
And Prime Minister, how do you see the trend? Are you optimistic about it? I think China has obviously targeted countries that it thinks it's most vulnerable to its campaign of co-option and coercion and concealment. I'm thinking, for example, Hungary or Serbia in particular, which has said it volunteers to be China's aircraft carrier in Europe. You had Italy sign up for One Belt, One Road, and see massive Chinese investments really across Europe, but focused in some key strategic locations like port facilities in Greece. Do you think that have we reached bottom in connection with countries' really failure to recognize the danger associated with these sorts of investments made for strategic purposes? And do you think we're finally waking up to the challenge?
Yeah, but all the examples you mentioned are examples how the Chinese are exercising their strategy in Europe. And we have seen that it has been increasingly difficult to achieve consensus within the European Union in, for instance, the criticism of Chinese violation of human rights. But I do believe that Europeans have become less naive. As an example, I could mention the recent development just before Christmas. The EU and China agreed in principle on a new investment deal between the EU and China, much to the surprise, actually, by the incoming Biden administration. Also to my surprise, I mean, I had hoped for closer coordination between Europe and America when it comes to such strategically important agreements with China. But it was agreed. But recently, China sanctioned a number of members of European Parliament, including a number of institutions in Europe, including my own Alliance of Democracies Foundation. And now, I'm sure, the European Parliament will not even speak about this new investment agreement as long as members of the Parliament are sanctioned by China. So it's an example that there are limits as to how far the Chinese can go. And the Europeans have opened their eyes now when it comes to China.
Prime Minister, you've been a leader, and you're maybe the most prominent leader in terms of promoting democracy, strengthening democracy, getting people to recognize that we are in a competition that has an ideological component. And as you mentioned, our rivals are authoritarian states, but they've become much more sophisticated than authoritarian states that we've had to compete with in the past. They have money, as you mentioned. They're growing militarily. They're strengthening social cohesion, especially maybe with these aggressive forms of nationalism. And I the way I think about it these days is Jakob Griegel thinks about it. He sees Russia, China, and maybe even Iran establishing civilizational states that are built on really a conscious effort to distinguish themselves from the West. What do you see as the challenges of this type of ideological competition? Are our democracies, are we strong enough? Are we united enough internally and among each other to face this ideological component of the threat?
No, the disunity within the community of free societies in the world is weakening us. And this is one of the reasons why we have seen autocracies advance during recent years. I think it's fair to say that during that now we have seen the 15th consecutive year of decline in freedom and democracy in the world. So we cannot take freedom and democracy for granted. This is the reason why we have to raise our voice to counter the advancing autocracies much stronger than in the past. My ambition would be to create an alliance of democracies, an alliance of the world's free societies would represent 60% of the global economy. That's a formidable force that would create a lot of respect, I think, not only in Beijing, but also in Moscow and in other capitals of autocratic states. So if the world's democracies could really unite around certain principles, then we have a chance to protect and promote the principles upon which we have built our free societies. In America, you have had a National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that has worked and recently published a report, which I would recommend to everybody. And in that report, the Commission recommends, so to speak, a technological alliance of democracies, that the world's democracies should unite around certain principles for the use of new technology. I think we all agree that artificial intelligence, for instance, can be used for peaceful purposes to make our daily lives easier, but it can also be used to monitor people, to control people, as the Chinese do. And we have to make sure, we who are living in free societies, we have to make sure that it's our principles, it's the principles of freedom and democracy that will be the global standards and norms for use of new technology. So that's just one example how an alliance of democracies could work.
Well, I'm glad to hear you recommend this AI Commission report. I'm a big fan of it as well. I'm a little bit biased, though, because my old chief of staff, Billy Bajraktari, ran that project. But I agree, the findings and recommendations are really clear, and they ought to, I think, help bring us together around a common agenda. And so I wondered, what more we might be able to do to help convince the private sector that they are part of this competition, right? I mean, we have the Nord Stream 2 issue, for example, in Germany, which has been much discussed. But there are many other issues involving 5G communications. We just had Belarus hijack an Orion Air airplane. And of course, you already mentioned the coercive actions of the Chinese Communist Party on clothing manufacturers, in China, forcing companies to deny Taiwan's sovereignty, for example. So, what more can we do you think, to educate the private sector and to help them recognize they're part of this competition? And what would your recommendations be for how the private sector can be part of this competition between democracies and authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I have discussed that issue on several occasions with business leaders, and many business leaders think, but I believe a bit naively, but they think that you can separate politics and business. But in the real world, that's not the case. And I think China is a terrible example of the mix of politics and business. As soon as you engage with China or Chinese businesses, you should be aware of the fact that you are engaging in de facto with the Chinese Communist Party as well. And many private companies are now exposed to consumer boycotts and retaliation from the Chinese. For instance, recently, the Chinese government threatened the Swedish private company Ericsson with retaliation if the Swedish government does not lift its ban against Huawei in rolling out the 5G network in Sweden. So it's a clear example that you have an interconnection between business and politics in China that you should be aware of. So I think what we should do to help our private businesses to deal with this would be to create what I would call an economic Article 5. Of course, my inspiration comes from my background as NATO Secretary General. As we have mentioned already, we do have the famous NATO military Article 5 that we consider an attack on one ally, an attack on all. Exactly the same should be the case when it comes to economy, that the world's free societies should commit to the principle that if a specific country will be exposed to economic blackmail or coercion from China, then we will help that specific country. And we should provide credit facilities for private companies that are exposed to such retaliatory measures from the Chinese government, so that they can finance actually exiting from China to other countries, or at least redefine their supply chains. So I think we can do much more to help each other within the community of democracies or free societies in the world.
And you mentioned Australia already. I think Australia was the wake-up call for this, right? I think this was the Chinese trying to kill one to scare 100. And we do have to work together, because otherwise China will just take a divide and conquer approach on this. And I really think this is the most important, maybe, battleground in connection with the competition with China. We do have some economic tools, Prime Minister. We use sanctions, for example, to punish or impose costs on Russia for the war in Ukraine, its occupation of Crimea, for its interference in domestic politics in the U.S. and Europe. But what is your assessment of how effective sanctions have been as a tool of foreign policy? Are they mitigating, in this case, Russia's behavior? Do you think they might in the future, or do you think we need to think of other more effective means of coercion or application of economic tools of statecraft?
I'm a free trader. So I do believe in free trade as the most efficient tool, but let me revert to this in a couple of minutes. First, I would say, in the lack of military confrontation with Russia or China. I do believe that sanctions may be the best tool we have at our disposal. But to make the sanctions effective, we need unity among the world's democracies and also across the Atlantic. We need to act swiftly. On the latter, we have seen how the European Union could act swiftly on Belarus after the unacceptable hijacking, so to speak, of the Ryanair plane. But no action has been seen yet. On Russia, we have the problem that sanctions against Russia will have to be renewed every 6 months, and it requires unanimity. All that stuff makes sanctions ineffective. So I do believe that sanctions are the best tool we do have at our disposal, but we need to improve this instrument. Having said that, I think in the long run, it's much more efficient if we increase or strengthen free trade between the world's democracies, because that would serve as a brilliant example, a good story of how democracies could flourish through free trade. For example, why not create a transatlantic free trade area, TAFTA, to remove trade barriers, to remove all duties on all goods, etc. Of course, we should take into account consumer protection, etc. But let's take on the great perspective. I do believe that free trade is to the benefit of all people. And if we could create incentives to agree on more free trade agreements among the world's democracies, then we could demonstrate a telling story to the world's autocracies. So in the longest perspective, I think free trade will be better than sanctions.
Yeah, I think the operative word is really reciprocity. And of course, you know that there are many U.S. concerns about access to the European Union market that have prevented really much progress on a new trade deal there. And this is a very important aspect of the U.S. European relationship. It is the core alliance we have. So I think the strengthening economic ties, how could that be bad? That would be good. And of course, it's a key aspect of competing against China. I think there has to be a correlation between Germany's over-reliance on exports to China and the fact that Chancellor Merkel was the big champion of the comprehensive agreement on investment for China. So I think this is all interconnected, as you've mentioned, in a way that is, I think, maybe unprecedented in terms of the threat of authoritarian regimes that are so active with forms of economic coercion. And so I would just, in closing, I'd like just to ask you for your general thoughts. You know, what more can we do in the transatlantic community to strengthen the relationship across the Atlantic, especially the U.S. relationship with Europe? What can we do from a diplomatic, a political perspective, but from a commercial and technological perspective? What is top on your agenda?
Yeah, let me refer to one of your previous questions about the European defense. I think one of the important elements in strengthening the transatlantic tie would be that the Europeans take more responsibility for their own security. I've never been against more European defense investments. On the contrary, I think a strengthening of the European pillar within NATO would also improve the overall relationship between America and Europe. Fair burden sharing, that is a cornerstone in a good relationship across the Atlantic. So that's one thing. Secondly, I already mentioned trade. I'm pleased to see that some of the immediate hurdles or obstacles in the trade relationship between the US and Europe have been removed. But I really think we have to think big. So that's why I'm in favor of a transatlantic free trade agreement. Of course, it should not be restricted to the transatlantic area, but let's start here because between America and Europe, we share not only interests, but also ideology. And that's why we, believers in democracy and freedom, we should be the front runners in promoting global free trade. And finally, I think it's important also to have a dialogue between America and Europe. In that respect, I think a down-to-earth proposal would be to open for free travel again between Europe and the United States. It's been stopped now for more than a year because of the corona crisis. As vaccinations have now been so widespread, I do believe that the condition is fulfilled for a reopening of travel across the Atlantic. We should not underestimate the value of the interpersonal interaction across the Atlantic. So these are some important elements in improving the transatlantic relationship.
Well, Prime Minister Rasmussen, thank you for that wide-ranging and so informative and insightful discussion. On behalf of the Hoover Institution, I think I speak for all of our audience as well to tell you that we've learned a great deal from you about Battlegrounds, important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today.
Thank you very much, General, and thank you for your many years of service, not only for the United States, but for global freedom and security. Thank you.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.